Welcome back to Walkabout. Today I'm going to show you how I use test data in my SwiftUI Previews. When working with SwiftUI, you can quickly work on your layout using previews. Those previews are really helpful in quickly designing your application and making sure it looks the way you want it to look. But it also comes with some caveats. I had issues when I tried to retrieve images over the internet and then it didn't work and my previews would crash or they would come extremely slow, etc. So in order to avoid all of that, I worked out a method that works for me that I want to share with you how I can easily use my previews to work on the layout of my views. So let's dive into that, how I did that, because maybe it's also useful for you. The first thing I did is I created a file with test data, and the test data that represents the models I have in my application. So if I look here in the project, I have some models. I have a file with called test data and I have test data. Now, for instance, this weather is a component I have here, weather, because I store a weather, and a weather is a object here, codable object with some properties and of course some computed properties as well to make it easier to use that. But I need to have that weather. And the test data here, I defined weather that I can pass in with data because I actually have that data initializer that will make sure it will parse it correctly and puts it into a data object. I need it as well because that data, that weather, is also stored in Firestore. Firestore returns a document, so I didn't have to add anything to my model to make this work. I just mimic the same layout that comes from Firestore here in my test data. So I have a weather, now I have two weather codes, just to make sure that I have some variation if I want to test that. I also did that for media, so I have some images, but the media is a little bit different because I gave my images an ID with some test image, etc. And I'll show you later why I did it this way, because it's helpful for me that I don't need to retrieve that image over the internet and don't need to go through my image cache. I'll show you in a minute. I have users and I have a name, a bio, some countries and another user. And then I got into my trips. I created some trips and the trip. And this is where it all becomes interesting. A trip has a user. So it has a user and then I just take one of the users I already have and I use the ref data. And this ref data is a method that I also developed for storing it into my database. So it is nothing new because a user has a lot of properties, but often I only want to store a reference to that user containing ID and name. And that's what I do with this method. Ref data returns me the reference and the name. And this way, again, I reuse what I already have, what I developed for my models in my test data. So I have my test strips here. Then I have my trip users. Trip users are where I define whether you're a follower or not. And that's just a simple record with a trip where I need the ref data of a trip, ID and name, where I need a user, also with the ref data. And I need to have a role, whether it's an owner or a follower. And in the future, some of you know, I work on collaborators. There might be collaborators as well. Now I go to my trip post, and the trip post has media. It has a message, has a place. This is still a project that I want to improve because I want to have these place objects reusable, but for now it's not. It has a trip, a user, and it has weather. And this is a post. And this way I create some posts for testing. And this is the test data I have right now that I want to make sure that I can use efficiently and quickly in my applications to work on previews. And of course, if I get more data, I'll extend it a little bit and I tweak it or I make some variations. But this is the basis that I use for everything that I'm doing in SwiftUI at the moment. And it works for me very well. Let me show a very simple one. I have an avatar here. And this avatar is a very simple object. It is initialized with the user ID and the size, as you can see here in my preview. Now, if I go to, I want to have small, I immediately see it in my preview. If I want to see a different user, I immediately see that in my preview. Let's make it large again, or medium, because you also can see that the medium works. And if I go to another user, 1, 2, 3. And these are the users that I have in my test data. I only have 3, so if I use a different ID, it will still crash, but this is working for now. I have the different users. But now about the image, because the image is loaded through my image loader, my avatar loader. So look into the avatar loader, and here I had to do a little bit of a trick to make sure that when it is running in preview, it does not go to my media cache to retrieve it from the cache. And if it's not in the cache, what is usually the case, if you're running it freshly, it will have to go over the internet to retrieve the image, and that isn't working from my preview, so the preview would crash, and actually it would cause quite a bit of hassle to recover from that. So if my processing environment running for previews is 1, then I just return a very simple image test avatar with the user ID. I had user ID 123, and here in my resources, I created in my assets an avatar 1, 2, and 3 with the images that I use. Now I understand it's a little bit of overkill to have those images, but for me it's a lot easier to have these 3 images, and it is working because I can show the images, and when I'm actually running it on a device or on the simulator, it will bypass that and it will retrieve the image from my cache if it's there, and otherwise it will go and start downloading it. But it helps me to quickly work on the layout of my my screen. The same, another example here is I have media of a trip. So I have a media to show, and this is test media 0, 1. I get different images, and this way you see the aspect ratio is correct. I can go through some of the images I have that I also use in other views. Now these were 2 very simple examples. So let's go into a little bit more complex example. Now that example isn't perfect yet because I'm still working on it. So it's not perfect, but it will show you the power of using previews in this kind of a way. So I have a post. A trip post has a complicated layout of images. The way it creates a mosaic of the images is a little bit tricky because I want to have the correct aspect ratios. And based on those aspect ratios, I fill in a grid that I have. In this case, I have an odd number of an even number of images, so I show it in rows, always 2 next to each other. If it's an odd number, I show the first one on top. You also see here I have a user with an avatar and a name, and no, it's a work in progress, so it's not perfect yet, but it's working. I now show my post 2. In my test data, that was my post here. This one it is showing with 4 images. So let's go to the previous one. So if we're here and I go to, let's say, 1. Immediately I see the layout change. You also see that it's not perfect yet, so I still have a little bit of a calculation issue. I see a different user with a different name here on top, and I can also go to 0. That again shows me, well, with 5 images and a different user, etc. And it makes it really easy for me now to work on this layout, to make sure I can, in this case, fix the issue here with the bug to do that. And to give you a little bit of an idea, in my preview I pass in a width, and that width is usually when I use this component coming from the geometry reader and passed in, and I think that's where my issue goes wrong. But in general, this is the way I use my previews, and I expand on it to make it a lot easier, to make it reflect immediately what I do. And I have learned that I do a lot of development now on my user interface, where I try to tweak it without actually going to the device or an emulator, and just develop it first in my previews, and also change the way I think about views to make them in smaller chunks, to compose then in the end the final application to do that. And I just wanted to share this with you because for me it's very helpful. It works. It saves me a lot of time when tweaking the layout, when you have to think about paddings and all kind of alignment issues, and you see the result almost immediately, because once you start working on the layout, it doesn't have to do a lot of recompiling. And as you saw, if I change some data, it's very quickly on the screen to represent the new layout and the new data. So just out of sharing information, what I do on Go and Walkabout, this is how I use my previews and my test data to make sure I can work on my layout a little bit quicker. I'll thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.